The cell door slammed shut behind me before I even hit the floor. My wrists were bound in some kind of energy cuff, humming faintly against my skin, and my knees scraped against a metal grate that smelled like burnt wiring and old blood that wasn't mine. 2 guards, tall and gray-skinned with eyes like polished stone, stood outside the bars watching me the way a person watches an insect they haven't decided whether to step on yet. I did not speak. I did not look up. I had learned a long time ago that the first thing you give away in a place like this is your face, and I wasn't ready to give anything away yet. Footsteps came down the corridor, light and unhurried, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who had never once in her life worried about being late. I kept my head down, but I could see the hem of a long silver robe stop just outside my cell. "So this is the human they caught," a voice said. It was smooth, almost musical, but underneath it was something sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. I expected something more frightening. I said nothing. "Look at me when I speak to you," she said. I lifted my eyes slowly. The woman standing there was unlike anything I had seen before, and I had seen a great many strange things in my years of service. Her skin held a faint blue shimmer under the harsh light of the ship. Her eyes were a deep violet, and she wore a crown made of woven metal that curved like small wings above her brow. Everything about her posture said she had never once been told no in her entire life. "You're Princess Vessa Thal," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Every soldier in this sector had heard the name. "And you," she said, tilting her head, studying me the way someone studies a strange insect pinned to a board, "are nothing. A soldier from a species that crawled out of its mud only a few centuries ago and decided it was ready to fight empires that have existed since before your ancestors learned to walk upright." The guards behind her laughed, a low rasping sound. I kept my expression flat. Silence had kept me alive more times than any weapon ever had. "Nothing to say?" Vessa asked, crouching slightly so she could look me directly in the eyes. "No pleading? No threats? No claims about how your people will come rescue you?" She smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "You humans are strange creatures. Half of you beg, half of you posture. You do neither." "Would it change anything if I did?" I asked. For a moment, something flickered behind her violet eyes, something like surprise, quickly buried under amusement. "No," she said, "it would not." "Then there's no point wasting the breath." She straightened up, folding her arms, studying me a moment longer before turning to her guards. "Bring him to the lower hall tomorrow. I want the court to see what a captured human soldier looks like up close. It will be good entertainment before the evening feast." "I am not entertainment," I said quietly. She paused at that, glancing back over her shoulder. "Everything in this ship exists for my entertainment, soldier. You are simply the newest addition." Then she walked away, her robe trailing behind her like a whisper, her guards following in step. I stayed on the floor of the cell long after the sound of her footsteps had faded, staring at the wall, thinking not about her insults, which meant nothing to me, but about how far this ship was from home, and how long it might take before anyone even realized I was missing. The hours in that cell moved strangely. There was no true day or night on a Vale cruiser, only the same pale artificial light humming from the ceiling, and the occasional passing of guards checking the prisoners like a farmer checking on livestock. I counted my breaths to keep my mind steady. I thought of the faces of the people I had served with, the ones who were gone, the ones who were still out there somewhere fighting a war that never seemed to end. I did not think of myself as a hero. I never had. Heroes belonged in stories told to children, stories with clean beginnings and satisfying endings. What I had lived through had no clean edges. It had only decisions, and consequences, and the long silence that followed both. The next morning, if it could be called morning, 2 guards came for me. They said nothing, simply gestured with their weapons for me to stand and walk. I did not resist. There was no point resisting men twice my size holding weapons that could turn a person to ash in a heartbeat. I walked between them through corridors lined with strange glowing markings, past windows that looked out onto the black expanse of space, dotted with stars I did not recognize. They brought me to a wide hall with a high, arched ceiling, the walls carved with images of Vale history, battles won, worlds conquered, empires bent to their will. At the far end of the hall, seated on a raised platform, was Princess Vessa Thal, surrounded by a circle of nobles and officers, all watching me the way people watch an animal being led into an arena. "Bring him closer," Vessa said, waving a hand lazily. The guards pushed me forward until I stood in the center of the hall, dozens of eyes on me. A few of the nobles murmured to each other, some laughing softly behind their hands. I recognized the look on their faces. It was the look people gave to something they believed could never possibly be a threat to them. "This," Vesa announced, standing and addressing the room, "is a soldier from the species currently causing so much trouble along our outer colonies. Look at him. Does this look like something that should worry an empire that has stood for 10,000 years?" Laughter rippled through the hall. I kept my eyes forward, my jaw tight, my hands still bound behind my back. I had been in worse rooms than this. I had stood in places where the walls were falling and the air itself was trying to kill me, and I had survived those. A room full of laughing nobles was nothing. "Tell us something, soldier," Vesa said, walking down from her platform and circling me slowly, the way a predator circles something it has already decided is prey. "Are you afraid?" "No," I said. "You should be." "I've been afraid before," I said. "It doesn't help." That earned a ripple of surprised murmurs from the crowd, though Vesa's expression did not change. "Interesting," she said. "Most prisoners either break immediately or pretend at bravery they don't feel. You seem to genuinely believe what you're saying." "I only say what's true," I replied. "There's no use in anything else." She studied me for a long moment, her violet eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to find the crack in my composure that she was certain had to be there. "What is your name, soldier?" I hesitated only a moment before answering. "Marcus Cade." The name meant nothing to her. I could see it in her face, the flicker of nothing, no recognition, no reaction. To her, in that moment, I was simply another captured soldier from a species she considered barely worth the trouble of conquering. She had no idea what that name meant to the people who had fought beside me, or to the people who had fought against me and lost. "Well, Marcus Cade," she said, turning back to her platform, "you will spend some time here as our guest while we decide what use you might be to us. Perhaps information, perhaps leverage, perhaps simply as an example to your people of what happens to those who resist us." She waved a hand dismissively. "Take him back to his cell." The guards grabbed my arms and turned me toward the door. As they led me away, I heard Vesa speaking to one of her advisors, her voice carrying easily across the hall. "Have someone search the wreckage of the vessel we captured him from," she said. "Pull whatever records remain. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with before we decide his fate." I did not react to those words, though something inside me went very still. I knew what those records would say. I had lived every line of them. The walk back to the cell felt longer than the walk out of it. My mind was calm, but somewhere underneath that calm was the quiet certainty that things were about to change, not because of anything I would do, but because of things I had already done, long before this ship had ever pulled me out of the wreckage of my downed transport. Back in the cell, I sat against the cold wall and closed my eyes, letting my breathing slow. Around me, other prisoners shifted in their cells, some human, some other species I did not recognize, all of them silent, all of them watching the world the way I was, waiting for whatever came next. I thought about the records the princess had ordered pulled from the wreckage. I thought about my own service file, buried somewhere in the archives of a war that had cost more than most people could imagine. I thought about names, both the ones I remembered and the ones I had tried very hard to forget. Somewhere far above me, in a chamber lit with soft golden light, a young scholar named Alira sat down at a console and began the long process of searching through recovered human data, looking for anything that might tell her people more about the strange, quiet soldier now sitting in their prison hold. She had no idea what she was about to find. Neither did I, not exactly, though a part of me already knew that whatever calm I had managed to hold on to in that hall was about to be tested in ways I had not expected, not by torture, not by threats, but by the simple, unavoidable truth of my own past, finally catching up to me in a place I had never imagined it would. The lights in my cell dimmed slightly as the ship shifted into its resting cycle, and I let myself lean back against the wall, closing my eyes, listening to the distant hum of engines carrying us further and further from anything I recognized as home. Tomorrow, I knew, would not be like today. Somewhere in the archives above me, a name was being pulled from the dust of old records, a name that belonged to me, attached to events that had reshaped entire regions of space. I did not know yet how the princess would react when she learned the truth. I only knew that the quiet, mocking laughter of that hall was about to fall silent in a way none of them expected. I did not sleep that night. I simply waited, the way I had learned to wait through every difficult stretch of my life, patient, still, and ready for whatever came through that door next. The scholar named Illyra did not sleep either. She had been assigned the task almost as an afterthought, a small errand handed down from the princess's court, the kind of task junior scholars were given when no one expected it to matter. Search the recovered data core from the wrecked human transport. Compile a summary, nothing more. At first, the files gave her exactly what she expected. Basic service records, supply manifests, communication logs between small human outposts along the border. She skimmed through hours of routine data, the ordinary noise of a species fighting a war it seemed destined to lose. She noted names, ranks, unit numbers, feeding them one by one into the translation engine, cataloging them the way she had cataloged 100 other prisoner files before. Then she reached a file labeled with a designation that made the translation engine pause. Marcus Cade. The name alone meant nothing to her, not yet. It was the file size that caught her attention first, far larger than any other single record in the entire data core, cross-referenced across dozens of other systems, flagged with markers she did not recognize. She opened it, expecting more routine information. What she found instead made her sit back in her chair. The file was not simply a service record. It was a chain of cross-references, pulling from human archives, but also from older Veil intelligence reports that had been filed away and largely forgotten, because the events they described had happened far from the central worlds, in regions few nobles ever bothered to think about. The first reference was a battle summary from a border conflict 13 years earlier, an engagement between human forces and the Korath Dominion, a smaller empire that had once been a close ally of the Veil. Illyra remembered hearing about the Korath Dominion in her early studies, though only in passing. A brief mention of a once powerful state that had collapsed suddenly and completely, its fleets destroyed, its capital worlds abandoned, its ruling family wiped from history within the span of a single terrible season. The report attributed the collapse to a coordinated human offensive. It listed one name, repeated across several documents, associated with the final engagement that broke the Dominion's last defensive line. Marcus Cade. Illyra felt a chill move through her as she kept reading. She pulled the next reference, a report about the disappearance of an entire fleet belonging to a faction known as the Ashen Choir, a group of mercenary raiders who had terrorized the border colonies for years, before vanishing entirely after a single engagement near a human outpost, designated only by numbers. The Veil intelligence services had never determined exactly what happened to that fleet. They simply stopped receiving transmissions, and no wreckage was ever found in significant enough quantity to explain the loss of so many ships. The report noted, almost as a footnote, that a distress signal recovered from a damaged Ashen Choir vessel weeks after the incident contained a partial recording of a single human voice, calm and steady, repeating the same short sentence over and over into the static. "This is Cade. Hold the line." Illyra's hands were trembling slightly now as she continued pulling threads from the archive, each one leading to another, each one confirming what she was beginning to suspect but did not want to believe. A colony world 13 years prior, a Veil settlement on the edge of contested space, had gone dark during what should have been a routine defensive operation against a rebellious faction. The official report at the time had listed the cause as an internal uprising among the colony's own security forces, a clean, tidy explanation that closed the file and let everyone move on without asking difficult questions. But buried in a supplementary report filed by a junior officer who had since been quietly reassigned to a distant post, there was a different account. An account describing a single human operative who had infiltrated the colony's command structure, who had turned the colony's own defenses against itself, who had ended an entire garrison's resistance in the span of one night, and who had vanished before any retaliation could be organized. The junior officer's report had included a physical description that matched, almost exactly, the man currently sitting in the prison hold 3 decks below where Illyra now sat frozen in her chair. She sat in silence for a long time after that, staring at the glowing text on her console, trying to make sense of what she was looking at. This was not the record of an ordinary soldier. This was the record of something else entirely, something her people had apparently encountered before, in different places, under different circumstances, and had never fully understood until the pieces were laid out side by side like this. She thought of the tired, quiet man she had briefly seen being led through the halls that morning, the one the nobles had laughed at, the one the princess had dismissed as unimpressive. She thought of how he had stood there, silent and still, while an entire hall mocked him, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach. Whatever this man was, whatever he had done, the people in that hall had no idea what they were actually looking at. Illyra knew she had to report this immediately, but she hesitated, her hand hovering over the console. A report like this, delivered carelessly, could cause panic, or worse, could be dismissed entirely by nobles too proud to believe that a human soldier could have accomplished what these records suggested. She needed to be careful. She needed to be thorough. She spent the next several hours cross-referencing every detail, building a complete timeline, connecting every fragment of evidence into a single undeniable picture. By the time she finished, the sun cycle lights of the ship had shifted into their brightest setting, signaling the start of a new day. She gathered the compiled file, her hands steady now, her mind made up, and made her way toward the princess's private chambers, knowing that what she was about to deliver would change everything. Princess Vesa Thal was in the middle of her morning preparations when Elira requested an urgent audience. She was seated before a mirror, attendants arranging the fine chains woven through her hair, when the doors opened and Elira entered, clutching a data tablet against her chest, like it might try to escape her grip. "This had better be important," Vesa said, not turning from the mirror. "I have court duties within the hour." "It concerns the human prisoner," Elira said. "Marcus Cade." Vesa's eyes flicked toward the mirror's reflection of the young scholar, catching the tension in her voice. She waved her attendants away with a small gesture, and they filed out silently, leaving the two of them alone in the chamber. "Go on," Vesa said, finally turning to face her. Elira stepped forward and placed the tablet on the table before the princess, activating the display. "I was asked to search the recovered data core from the wreckage where he was captured. I expected to find a standard service record. Instead, I found this." Vesa took the tablet, scanning the first few lines with the mild interest of someone humoring a subordinate. Her expression did not change at first. Then her eyes moved to the second file, and the third, and Elira watched the princess's posture shift, subtly at first, her shoulders straightening, her jaw tightening. "This is a mistake," Vesa said quietly, though there was less certainty in her voice than the words suggested. "These records must be corrupted, or falsified. A single human soldier could not have caused the collapse of the Korath Dominion. It was an internal power struggle. Every report at the time confirmed it." "I thought so too," Elira said carefully, "until I cross-referenced the timing. The internal power struggle within the Korath ruling family began less than a day after the final human offensive was recorded in this file. The timeline is not a coincidence, Your Highness. It is a cover story that was accepted because no one wanted to believe the alternative." Vesa was silent for a long moment, her eyes still scanning the display, moving faster now, absorbing the details of the Ashen Choir's disappearance, the colony uprising that had never truly been an uprising at all. Elira watched the color drain slightly from the princess's face as she reached the final section of the compiled report, a summary listing the estimated total losses attributed, directly or indirectly, to actions connected to a single designation: Marcus Cade. The number was large enough that Vesa read it twice, as if the second reading might reveal it to be a typographical error. "He is sitting in our prison hold," Vesa said quietly, almost to herself. "I stood in front of him yesterday. I mocked him in front of the entire court. I called him nothing." "Your Highness," Elira said gently, "I do not believe he is nothing." Vesa set the tablet down slowly, her hands folding in her lap, her mind clearly racing through the memory of the previous day, replaying every word she had spoken, every laugh she had encouraged from the nobles gathered in that hall. She had stood in front of a man capable of ending empires, and had treated him like a curiosity, a piece of entertainment for a bored afternoon. "Does anyone else know of this?" Vesa asked. "No one, Your Highness. I brought it directly to you." "Keep it that way," Vesa said, standing abruptly and moving toward the window, staring out at the vast darkness of space beyond the glass. "Until I decide how to proceed, this information does not leave this room." Elira bowed slightly. "Understood." Vesa remained silent for a long time, watching the distant stars, her mind turning over the strange, quiet man in the cell below, replaying his calm voice, his steady eyes, the way he had refused to flinch or beg or posture in the face of an entire hall's mockery. She had assumed it was simple ignorance, a soldier too foolish or too broken to understand the danger he was in. Now she understood it differently. He had not been ignorant of the danger. He had simply already lived through worse. "Bring him to my private chamber," Vesa finally said, turning away from the window, quietly. "I do not want the court to know yet. I want to speak with him myself before I decide what any of this means." Elira nodded and moved to carry out the order, though as she reached the door, she paused and looked back at the princess, who was still staring at the darkness beyond the glass, her earlier confidence noticeably absent from her posture. "Your Highness," Elira said quietly, "may I ask what you intend to say to him?" Vesa was silent for a moment before answering. "I do not know yet," she admitted. "For the first time since I boarded this ship, I genuinely do not know." Down in the prison hold, I sat against the cold wall of my cell, unaware of the conversation taking place several decks above me, unaware that the calm, careful walls I had built around myself over the years were about to be tested in a way I had not expected. I only knew that the guards outside my cell had gone quiet, exchanging glances I did not understand, and that something in the air of the ship had shifted since the morning before. I did not know yet that my name had already reached the princess's chambers. I did not know that everything she thought she understood about me and about my people was about to be rewritten. I simply waited, the way I always had, listening to the quiet hum of the ship carrying us both toward a conversation neither of us was fully ready for. 2 guards came for me later that day, but this time there was something different in the way they moved. They did not shove me forward the way they had the day before. They did not speak to each other in that low, mocking tone I had grown used to hearing. They walked beside me in near silence, their eyes occasionally flicking toward me with something I could only describe as caution. I did not ask questions. In my experience, questions asked of captors rarely earned honest answers, and silence often told me more than words ever could. Instead of the wide public hall from before, they led me through a series of narrower corridors, deeper into the ship, until we reached a set of tall doors carved with intricate patterns that reminded me of frozen waves. One of the guards pressed his hand against a panel beside the door, and it slid open silently, revealing a private chamber lit with soft golden light. Princess Vesa Thal stood near a window at the far end of the room, her back to me, staring out at the stars. She did not turn when the doors opened. "Leave us," she said to the guards. They hesitated only a moment before obeying, the doors sliding shut behind them, leaving the 2 of us alone in a silence that felt heavier than anything I had experienced since being captured. "Sit," Vesa said, gesturing toward a chair near a low table without turning around. I remained standing. "I'm fine where I am." She finally turned to face me, and I noticed immediately that something about her had changed since the day before. The mocking confidence that had filled the hall was gone, replaced by something more careful, more measured, as though she were studying a puzzle she had only just realized was far more complicated than she first believed. "You destroyed the Korath Dominion," she said, without any preamble, watching my face closely as she spoke the words. I kept my expression steady, though something inside me tightened. That's not exactly how I would put it. "How would you put it then?" I was quiet for a long moment, considering how much to say, how much truth this woman had actually earned from me. She had mocked me in front of her entire court less than a day earlier. She had called me nothing, an insect not worth fearing. Now she stood here asking me to explain events I had spent years trying not to think about. "You read the reports," I said finally. "What do they say?" "They say a single human soldier ended an empire that had existed for centuries," Vesa said. "They say you destroyed a mercenary fleet that had terrorized this entire sector for years. They say you turned an entire colony against itself in a single night. I want to hear it from you, not from old files written by people who were not there." I studied her for a long moment. There was something different in her eyes now, not the amused cruelty from the hall, but something closer to genuine confusion, as though the story she had always believed about her own history and about my species was cracking apart in front of her. "Sit down," I said quietly. "If you want the truth, it's not a short story." She hesitated, then moved to the chair across from me, and for the first time since I had been captured, I lowered myself into the seat across the low table. No guards standing over me. No crowd laughing in the background, just the 2 of us, and the quiet hum of the ship. "The Korath Dominion," I began, "wasn't destroyed because I wanted power, or glory, or revenge. It was destroyed because they gave us no other option." Vesa's brow furrowed slightly. "Explain." I took a slow breath, letting my mind drift back to a place I rarely allowed myself to visit anymore. 13 years ago, my unit was stationed at a border outpost called Halden's Rest. It wasn't much, just a small colony, a few thousand people, mostly farmers and engineers, with a handful of soldiers assigned to protect it, because it sat near a resource corridor the Dominion wanted control of. "I know the region," Vesa said quietly. "It was contested territory." "It was our home," I said. "For the people living there, it wasn't a line on a map. It was where their children went to school, where they buried their families." The Dominion didn't see it that way. They saw resources. They saw a weak, disorganized species that hadn't yet learned to defend what belonged to them. Vesa said nothing, watching me closely. "They came with 3 warships," I continued. "We had almost nothing to defend ourselves with. A handful of outdated defense platforms, some ground troops, civilian volunteers, who had never held a weapon in their lives. The Dominion commander sent a message before the attack began. He told us we could surrender the colony, evacuate quietly, and live. Or we could resist, and die as an example to any other human settlement that thought about defying Dominion expansion. What did your commanding officers decide? They decided to fight, I said. Not because they thought we could win. Because the evacuation ships weren't ready yet, and if we surrendered immediately, thousands of civilians would have been left stranded on the surface when the Dominion took the colony anyway. We needed time. Fighting was the only way to buy it. I paused, remembering the sound of alarms in the dark, the tremor of the ground beneath the first bombardment, the faces of soldiers half my age trying to hide how frightened they were. We held for 6 days, I said quietly. 6 days longer than anyone thought was possible. By the end, most of my unit was gone. I was one of maybe a dozen soldiers still standing when the evacuation ships finally launched, carrying almost everyone who had survived. But the Dominion wasn't going to let that stand. They wanted the colony intact, and they wanted an example made of the soldiers who had cost them 6 days and a significant portion of their assault force. So what did you do? Vesa asked, her voice quieter now. I did the only thing that made sense at the time, I said. I stayed behind while the last transport left, along with a few volunteers who refused to go without making sure the rest of us had covering time. We used what was left of the colony's defense systems, rigged them beyond their intended limits, and when the Dominion ground forces moved in to secure what they thought was an empty colony, we brought the entire command structure of their assault force down with us. Vesa's eyes widened slightly. You destroyed their command ships. Not directly, I said. We disabled their shield generators long enough for the last of our orbital defense platforms to get clean shots at their bridge sections. It wasn't some brilliant strategy. It was desperation. We had nothing left to lose, and they had grown careless, certain that a handful of remaining human defenders posed no real threat to warships that size. And the aftermath? The Dominion lost 3 warships and most of their senior command staff in that engagement, I said. That alone wouldn't have destroyed an empire that size, but the Dominion's political structure was already fragile, held together mostly by the reputation of the ruling family and the fear their military projected across the region. When word spread that their supposedly unstoppable fleet had been crippled by a handful of human defenders at a colony they were supposed to walk through in an afternoon, that fear cracked. Rival factions within the Dominion saw an opportunity. The internal power struggle that followed wasn't something I orchestrated. It was something their own instability caused, once the illusion of their invincibility was broken. Vesa was silent for a long moment, absorbing what I had said. The reports made it sound like a deliberate campaign, she finally said. Like you had planned the collapse of their entire government. I didn't plan anything beyond trying to keep as many people alive as possible for 6 days, I said. Everything after that was consequence, not design. I'm not a strategist who brought down an empire on purpose. I'm a soldier who did what was necessary to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and the fallout from that happened to be larger than anyone expected, myself included. And the Ashen Choir? Vesa asked. The mercenary fleet? I felt my jaw tighten slightly at the memory. That was different, I said. Less about defense, more about necessity of a different kind. The Ashen Choir had been raiding human colonies for years, taking whatever they wanted, leaving nothing behind but wreckage and empty settlements. After Halden's Rest, when word spread about what had happened there, some in my chain of command decided I might be useful for other operations. I didn't love the idea of becoming some kind of symbol, but the Ashen Choir had just hit another colony, and there wasn't time for slow, careful solutions. What did you do? I infiltrated their flagship during a supply exchange, I said. Small crew. Minimal defenses expected because mercenary fleets rarely worried about direct retaliation from a species they considered too disorganized to strike back. I disabled their communication systems, then their propulsion, then made sure their weapons couldn't be used against the colony transports still trying to evacuate nearby. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late for them to regroup. The report said the entire fleet disappeared, Vesa said. No wreckage was ever found. Their ships weren't destroyed the way the Dominions were, I said quietly. Some of them were disabled and left adrift, far outside any shipping lane, in a region with no habitable systems nearby. I'm not proud of that particular operation. It wasn't clean, and there are things about it I don't discuss, even with my own people. But the raids on human colonies in that sector stopped afterward, and that's the only outcome I ever cared about. Vesa studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And the colony, she said. Our colony. 13 years ago. I met her eyes directly for the first time since sitting down. I'm not going to pretend that one doesn't matter, I said. It does. More than the others, honestly. Tell me, Vesa said, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. That colony's garrison had been using the surrounding region as a staging point for raids against nearby human settlements, I said. Officially, they were listed as a defensive outpost. In practice, the commander running that garrison had been authorizing strikes against undefended human colonies, calling them necessary security operations, while looting resources and covering the evidence in his official reports back to your central command. Vesa's expression shifted, something like discomfort crossing her features. I was not aware of that. Most weren't, I said. That commander was very good at hiding what he was doing from his superiors. I was sent in, alone, to gather evidence and, if necessary, end the threat directly. I spent weeks inside that colony, working alongside people who had no idea who I really was, learning the structure of their command, waiting for the right moment. And when the moment came, I made sure the evidence of what that commander had been doing reached the right people within his own garrison, I said. People who were as horrified by his actions as I was, once they understood the full picture. What followed wasn't me destroying anything directly. It was his own soldiers turning against a commander who had been using them to commit atrocities he had hidden from everyone, including them. The report called it an uprising, Vesa said quietly. It was an uprising, I said. I simply made sure the right people had the truth they needed to act on it. I'm not going to claim my hands were clean in that operation. I made choices that led directly to violence, and people died because of decisions I made. I've never pretended otherwise, not to myself, and not to anyone who's asked. The room was silent for a long moment after that, the soft hum of the ship the only sound between us. Vesa sat very still, her earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like genuine reflection. You didn't do any of this because you wanted to, she finally said. No, I said. I did it because I didn't see another way to keep people alive, or to stop something worse from happening. That's the truth, whether it makes for a satisfying story or not. I'm not a legend, princess. I'm not some grand weapon built for conquest. I'm a soldier who kept ending up in situations where the only path forward involved things I'll never be entirely at peace with. Vesa looked at me for a long time, her violet eyes searching my face as though trying to reconcile the calm, tired man sitting across from her with the events described in the files Alira had shown her that morning. Yesterday, she said slowly, I stood in front of you and called you nothing. I let my court laugh at you as though you were some curiosity captured for our amusement. You didn't know, I said. That is not an excuse, she said, her voice quieter now, almost bitter. I judged you based on nothing but the assumptions my people have held about yours for longer than either of us have been alive. I was wrong. Not simply about your capabilities, about you. I did not respond immediately. There was nothing satisfying about hearing an apology from someone who had mocked me only a day before, not because I doubted her sincerity, but because none of it changed the weight of what I carried, or the years of consequence that had led me to this cell in the first place. What happens now? I finally asked. Vesa was quiet for a moment, glancing toward the window, toward the stars beyond the glass. I do not know yet, she admitted, but I no longer believe keeping you as entertainment for my court is the right course of action. Whatever you are, Marcus Cade, you are not nothing. And I suspect the true danger to this ship, and to my people, was never you at all. I frowned slightly at that. What do you mean? Before she could answer, the chamber lights flickered once, briefly, followed by a low tremor that moved through the floor beneath our feet. Vesa's head snapped toward the door, her earlier composure replaced instantly by alertness. That was not a routine system fluctuation, she said quietly, standing quickly from her chair. I stood as well, every instinct I had built over years of service suddenly sharpening to attention. Someone's attacking the ship. Vesa turned to look at me, her expression caught somewhere between fear and calculation, as though she were only now beginning to understand just how quickly the balance of power in this room, and on this ship, might be about to shift entirely. An alarm began to sound through the corridors, a low pulsing tone that made my pulse quicken in a way I recognized instantly, the old, familiar tightening in my chest that came right before things turned bad. Vesa moved toward the door, tapping a panel beside it that lit up with a stream of information in her language. What is it? I asked. Unidentified vessels have dropped out of transit space near our position, she said, scanning the readout quickly. Multiple contacts. They are not responding to hails. Her jaw tightened. This far from any patrol route, unregistered ships this size do not appear by accident. How many? 6. she said, possibly more still emerging. I felt the old instincts settle over me like a second skin, the same clarity that had carried me through Halden's Rest, through the Ashen Choir's flagship, through every terrible night I had spent doing things I wished no one had ever needed me to do. 6 ships against a single cruiser isn't a border patrol stumbling into you by accident, I said. That's an ambush. Vesa looked at me sharply. You believe this was planned? I believe someone knew exactly where this ship would be, I said. Which means either someone on board leaked your travel route, or someone has been tracking this vessel for longer than you realize. Before she could respond, the doors to the chamber slid open, and a Veil officer rushed in, breathing hard, his uniform slightly disheveled from moving quickly through the ship. He was older, gray-haired, with a scar running along one side of his jaw that told me he had seen real combat at some point in his life, not just ceremonial postings. Your Highness, he said, bowing quickly. The unidentified vessels have begun broadcasting a message. I believe you should hear it directly. Vesa nodded sharply. Play it. The officer activated a small device on his wrist, and a garbled, distorted voice filled the chamber, speaking in a language I did not understand but whose tone needed no translation. It was cold, confident, the voice of someone who believed they already held every advantage. Vesa's expression darkened as she listened. When the message ended, she turned to the officer. Translate for our guest, she said, gesturing toward me. The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of sharing sensitive information with a prisoner, but a firm look from Vesa settled the matter. The message identifies itself as originating from remnants of the Korath Dominion, he said. They demand the immediate surrender of this vessel, along with the human prisoner currently held in our custody. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. They know I'm here. It appears so, the officer said grimly. How? Vesa demanded. This mission was not publicly logged. Only a handful of senior officers knew our flight path. I do not know, Your Highness, the officer admitted, but whoever informed them clearly wanted this specific outcome. They are not simply attacking a Veil vessel. They are attacking this vessel, specifically, because of who is aboard it. Vesa turned to me, her expression unreadable. It seems the past you described to me only moments ago has caught up with both of us rather quickly. They're Dominion remnants, I said. Whatever's left of a shattered government looking for something to rebuild their pride around. If they've spent 13 years hunting for the person responsible for their empire's collapse, capturing or killing me would mean more to them than anything they could gain from simply attacking a Veil ship. Then they will not stop until they have you, Vesa said quietly. No, I said. They won't. The old officer looked between the two of us, clearly uncertain how to process the shift in dynamic between the princess and her prisoner, but there was no time to explain. Another tremor moved through the ship, stronger this time, followed by a distant sound like distant thunder rolling through the hull. They're firing on us, Vesa said, moving quickly toward the door. Wait, I said. She turned back, impatience flickering across her face despite everything that had shifted between us in the past hour. We do not have time to wait, soldier. If they want me specifically, I said, then handing me over might buy this ship enough time to escape. Vesa's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting I surrender you to remnants of an empire that would likely execute you the moment they had you in their custody? I'm suggesting you consider every option, I said, including the ones that don't put your crew at risk. No, Sessa said firmly, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there the day before, something that sounded less like the cold command of a princess, and more like genuine conviction. I mocked you in front of my entire court less than a day ago because I believed you were nothing. I will not compound that mistake by handing you over to be executed simply because it might be convenient. There has to be another way. I studied her for a long moment, surprised despite myself by the shift in her tone. Then we need information, I said. How many crew members are trained for combat aboard this ship? Perhaps 200, the old officer answered, though most are ceremonial guards, not accustomed to actual engagement. And weapon systems? Standard defensive armament, Vesa said, sufficient against pirates or minor threats. But this ship was built as a diplomatic vessel, not a warship. Against 6 hostile ships, even disabled or damaged ones, we are significantly outmatched. I ran through the numbers in my head, old habits from years of impossible odds settling into familiar patterns. What about the ship's internal defenses? Bulkhead controls, emergency systems, anything that could slow down a boarding party if it comes to that? The officer looked at Vesa uncertainly, clearly unaccustomed to a human prisoner suddenly directing tactical questions in the middle of a crisis, but Vesa gave a small nod, granting silent permission. The ship has standard containment protocols, the officer said, emergency bulkheads that can seal off sections in the event of hull breaches. There are also maintenance corridors throughout the vessel not typically used by crew, narrow enough that they were never intended for large-scale movement. Good, I said. That's something we can use. Vesa studied me carefully. You have a plan. I have the beginning of one, I said. But I need you to trust me, and I understand that after only a single conversation, that might be a difficult thing to ask. For a long moment, Vesa said nothing, her violet eyes searching my face the way they had in the prison hold, though the expression behind them had changed entirely from mockery to something far more serious. Yesterday, she said slowly, I would have laughed at the idea of trusting a human prisoner with the safety of my ship. Today, I have read files describing exactly what you are capable of, and I have heard directly from you why you did the things described in them. I do not trust easily, Marcus Cade, but I am willing to listen. That's enough, I said, for now. Another impact shook the ship, harder this time, followed by the sound of alarms shifting tone, a sharper, more urgent pulse that even I recognized as the universal signal for imminent danger, regardless of species or language. They're closing the distance, the officer said, checking a device on his wrist. Weapons range in minutes. Then we don't have time to waste, I said, turning to Vesa. Release my restraints. She hesitated only a moment before nodding to the officer, who moved forward and deactivated the energy cuffs still bound around my wrists. I flexed my hands slowly, feeling the strange mix of relief and readiness that came with finally being unbound after so many hours of restraint. If I am wrong about you, Vesa said quietly, watching me carefully, this decision will cost me far more than my pride. You're not wrong, I said. But I understand why it's hard to be certain. She held my gaze for a long moment before nodding once, firmly, the decision made. Tell me what you need. First, I said, I need a full layout of this ship, every corridor, every access point, every weak spot in your defenses. If those remnants intend to board us, I want to know this ship better than they do before they ever set foot inside it. The officer moved quickly to a nearby console, pulling up a detailed schematic of the vessel that filled the air above the table in a shimmering blue projection. I studied it carefully, my mind already working through possibilities, angles, choke points, the same calculations that had kept me alive through 6 days at Halden's Rest, through a mercenary flagship, through a colony full of people who had no idea who was really walking among them. These maintenance corridors, I said, pointing to a series of narrow passages running along the outer sections of the ship, do they connect to the main boarding points? They do, the officer confirmed, though they were never designed for tactical movement. That's exactly why they'll work, I said. Whoever is planning this boarding will expect resistance through the main corridors, not through maintenance access most crews forget even exist. Vesa leaned over the projection, studying the layout with newfound focus. You intend to use the ship itself against them. I intend to make sure that if they board this vessel expecting an easy prize, they find something very different waiting for them instead, I said. For the first time since I had met her, I saw something shift in Vesa's expression that was not mockery, not fear, not even simple respect. It was something closer to recognition, the dawning understanding that the man she had dismissed as nothing the day before might be the only reason her ship, and everyone aboard it, survived what was coming. Then let us not waste any more time, she said, turning to the officer. Gather whoever among the crew has combat training. Marcus Cade will brief them personally. The officer's eyes widened slightly at the order, clearly startled by the idea of a human prisoner briefing Veil soldiers, but a sharp look from Vesa silenced any protest before it could form. He bowed quickly and hurried from the chamber to carry out her instructions. Vesa turned back to me once he had gone, her expression serious. Understand this, Marcus Cade. I am trusting you with the lives of everyone aboard this ship, based on a single conversation and a stack of files describing events that happened years before I ever knew your name. If I am wrong to trust you, the consequences will fall on all of us. You're not wrong, I said again, meeting her eyes steadily. I didn't destroy the Korath Dominion because I wanted power. I'm not going to let their remnants take this ship because I want revenge either. I'm going to help you because that's what I do. It's the only thing I've ever really known how to do. Vesa studied me a moment longer before giving a small, decisive nod. Then let us see exactly what you are capable of, soldier. Together, this time, rather than as captor and prisoner. The ship shuddered again beneath another impact, and somewhere beyond the reinforced walls of the chamber, 6 hostile vessels closed in through the dark, carrying with them remnants of an empire that had spent 13 years waiting for a chance at revenge they believed was finally within reach. They had no idea that the very thing they had come to capture was about to become the reason their plan failed completely. The briefing room filled quickly with Veil soldiers, most of them young, some of them clearly nervous at the sight of a human standing at the front of the room instead of behind bars. I did not waste time explaining who I was or what I had done. There would be time for questions later, if any of us survived long enough to ask them. "Listen closely," I said, my voice carrying across the room the way it had during briefings years ago, back when I still wore a different uniform and answered to a different chain of command. 6 ships are closing on this position. They intend to disable this vessel and board it, and they are specifically looking for me. That means every corridor near the main airlocks and hangar bays will see the heaviest resistance from their boarding parties. We are not going to give them the fight they expect. A young officer near the front raised a hand hesitantly. "What fight are we going to give them instead?" "The one they don't see coming," I said. "Princess Vesa has authorized use of the maintenance corridors throughout this ship. Most boarding parties will expect defenders concentrated at obvious access points. We're going to let them think that's exactly what's happening, while the majority of trained personnel move through these narrow passages to flank them once they've committed to a breach point." I gestured to the projection still hovering above the table, tracing the path I had mapped out with the officer earlier. "Here, here, and here," I said, pointing to 3 sections of the ship. "These are the most likely breach points based on standard boarding tactics. We reinforce these areas just enough to look like a real defense, while the bulk of our force moves through maintenance access, to hit them from angles they won't expect." Vesa stood near the back of the room, watching the briefing unfold with an expression of quiet intensity. I could feel the weight of her attention, the same careful calculation I had seen in her eyes back in her private chamber, though now it was aimed outward, toward the coming fight, rather than at me directly. "What about the ship's weapons systems?" another officer asked. "Focus defensive fire on disabling their ability to maneuver, not destroying them outright," I said. "If we can cripple their propulsion before they get close enough to board, we avoid this fight entirely. But we need to prepare for the possibility that boarding happens regardless." The room fell into focused motion after that, officers moving to relay orders, soldiers checking equipment, the calm, practiced rhythm of people preparing for something they knew was coming and could not avoid. I moved through the room, offering guidance where it was needed, correcting positioning on the projected map, answering questions with the same steady patience I had used with soldiers under my command years before. Vesa approached me as the room began to empty, the last of the officers filing out to take their positions. "You command a room full of strangers as though you have done this 1,000 times before," she said quietly. "I have," I said. "Just never for a crew that spent yesterday laughing at me in a public hall." She winced slightly at that, though she did not look away. "I deserve that." "Maybe," I said, "but there's no use dwelling on it now. We have a fight coming." The ship shuddered again, harder this time, the sound of distant impacts growing more frequent as the hostile vessels closed the remaining distance. Vesa's communication device chimed sharply, and she answered it quickly, listening to a rapid stream of information before her expression tightened. "They've launched boarding craft," she said. "Multiple vessels, converging on the sections you identified." "Then it's time," I said. We moved quickly through the corridors, Vesa staying close beside me despite the obvious danger, refusing the suggestion from her officers that she retreat to a secured section of the ship. "I will not hide while my people fight a battle I helped create the conditions for," she said firmly, silencing any further argument on the matter. The first breach came at the forward hangar bay, exactly where I had predicted. Alarms blared as the outer hull buckled under a targeted charge, and Dominion remnant soldiers began pouring through the opening, armed and moving with the confident efficiency of people who believed they were about to secure an easy victory. They were not expecting the ambush waiting for them. Soldiers positioned along the maintenance corridors moved into position exactly as briefed, cutting off the boarding party's retreat, while defenders at the main breach point held their line just long enough to draw the invaders fully into the trap. The fighting that followed was fast and brutal, the confined corridors of the ship turning into a chaotic tangle of movement and noise. But the plan held, and within minutes the first boarding party had been neutralized, their weapons and equipment secured by Veil soldiers who had, only hours earlier, doubted whether a human prisoner's tactics could possibly work. I stayed near Vesa throughout the engagement, not because she needed protecting in the way her guards might have assumed, but because I understood that the true target of this attack was not the ship itself. It was me. Every decision I made needed to account for the possibility that Dominion remnants would attempt to bypass conventional resistance entirely and drive straight toward wherever I happened to be standing. That instinct proved correct sooner than I expected. A second, smaller breach occurred not at any of the 3 predicted points, but along a secondary corridor near the ship's central command section, an access point I had not flagged as high priority because it required specialized knowledge of the ship's internal layout to locate. Someone on the Dominion side knew this ship intimately, which meant, once again, that whoever had informed them of my location had likely provided far more than a simple travel itinerary. "They're moving toward the command deck," Vesa said sharply, checking updates from her officers. "Toward you," I said grimly, the realization settling quickly. If they can't get to me directly, taking the ship's leadership is the next best option for leverage. We moved quickly, Vesa's remaining guards falling into formation around us as we made our way toward the command section, though I insisted on taking point, my instincts sharpening into the familiar focused clarity that had carried me through every impossible fight of my career. The corridors here were narrower, the lighting dimmer, and I could hear the distant sound of boots and weapons fire growing closer with every step. We rounded a final corner just as a small group of Dominion remnant soldiers breached a secondary door leading toward the command deck, their leader immediately recognizable by the deeper red markings on his armor, a color I remembered from years of studying Dominion military hierarchy. He was an officer, likely one of the last surviving members of the old command structure that had once ruled the empire I had helped bring down. His eyes locked onto me instantly, and something like triumph flickered across his expression despite the chaos around him. "Cade," he said, his translated voice carrying clearly through the corridor. 13 years, and here you are. "You've had a long time to plan this," I said, my voice steady despite the tension coiling through my body. "Long enough," he said. "Long enough to watch what remained of my people's empire collapse into scattered factions fighting over the wreckage you left behind. Long enough to decide that finding you again would be worth whatever it took. Then you know how this ends," I said. "I know how I intend it to end," he replied, raising his weapon. What followed was fast, chaotic, and far from the clean, decisive victory that stories often promised. Vesa's guards moved to engage the remaining soldiers accompanying the Dominion officer, while I focused entirely on the man who had clearly built 13 years of purpose around finding me. I will not pretend the fight was easy, or that it unfolded without cost. 2 of Vesa's guards were injured badly enough that they had to be pulled from the fight entirely, carried back toward the ship's medical bay by soldiers who refused to leave them behind despite the ongoing danger. But in the end, the Dominion officer's plan, built on years of anger and a desire for a reckoning he believed was owed to him, faltered against the simple reality that I had survived worse odds than this, more times than I could easily count. When the fighting in that corridor finally ended, the remaining Dominion remnants had been subdued, their leader disarmed and restrained, the immediate threat to the command deck neutralized. Vesa stood a short distance away throughout the final moments of the engagement, her own weapon drawn, having refused every suggestion that she retreat to safety while her people fought. When the corridor finally fell silent, she lowered her weapon slowly, her eyes moving across the aftermath before settling on me. "You're injured," she said, noticing the shallow cut along my arm that I had barely registered in the moment. "It's nothing," I said. "I've had worse." "That does not make me feel better about the statement," she said, though there was something close to relief in her voice. Reports began filtering in over the next several minutes, as the remaining boarding parties across the ship were neutralized or repelled, the hostile vessels outside forced into retreat once their propulsion systems had been sufficiently damaged by the ship's defensive fire, exactly as I had hoped. By the time the alarms finally quieted and the ship's systems confirmed no further threats remained, the corridors were filled with exhausted soldiers, some tending to injuries, others simply sitting in stunned silence at having survived an engagement most of them had believed impossible only hours earlier. Vesa found me later, standing near a viewport overlooking the retreating remnants of the Dominion attack force, watching the damaged ships limp away into the darkness of space. She approached quietly, standing beside me without immediately speaking, both of us simply watching the aftermath of a fight neither of us had expected to survive so cleanly. "You saved this ship," she finally said. "You saved my life, and the lives of my crew, despite everything I said to you only 2 days ago." "I didn't do it for gratitude," I said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I understood what was at stake if I didn't." "I know," she said quietly. "That is precisely what makes it matter more." We stood in silence for a long moment before she spoke again, her voice more thoughtful now, the last traces of her earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by something far more genuine. "I misjudged you," she said, "not simply as a soldier, but as a person. I looked at you and saw only what my people had been taught to see in yours, a species too young, too disorganized, too far beneath us to matter. I was wrong, and I suspect my error was shared by far more of my people than I would like to admit." "Most people judge what they don't understand," I said. "It's not unique to your people. Mine do the same thing constantly." "Perhaps," she said, "but understanding does not excuse the harm caused by that judgment. I mocked you in front of my entire court. I called you nothing. And yet, when it mattered most, you chose to protect this ship and everyone aboard it anyway. That's who I am," I said simply. "It's not about what you said to me. It never was." Vesa turned to face me fully, her violet eyes studying my face with an intensity that felt different from anything I had seen from her before. Not calculation, not mockery, but something closer to genuine respect. "I intend to make a formal report to my father, regarding everything that has happened here," she said. "Not simply the attack, but the truth about who you are, and what you have done for us, despite how poorly we treated you upon your capture." "What will that report say?" I asked. "That the human species is not the primitive threat many among my people believe it to be," she said. "That there are individuals among you capable of reshaping the fate of empires, not through conquest or ambition, but through necessity and sacrifice, most of my own people would struggle to understand. And that perhaps, rather than continued conflict, there may be wisdom in seeking a different kind of relationship with your people entirely." I studied her for a long moment, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "That's a significant shift from where we started 2 days ago. A great deal can change in 2 days," she said, a faint, genuine smile finally touching her expression, the first I had seen from her that held no trace of cruelty or mockery. "Especially when the person you once dismissed as nothing turns out to be the reason you and everyone you are responsible for are still alive to have this conversation." Outside the viewport, the damaged remnants of the Dominion attack force continued their slow retreat into the darkness. The immediate threat finally passed. I did not know yet what would come of Vesa's promised report, whether it would lead to lasting change between our two peoples or simply remain a well-intentioned gesture lost among the larger currents of interstellar politics. I had learned, over many years of hard experience, not to expect grand transformations from single moments, however significant they felt in the instant. But standing there beside a princess who had once mocked me without hesitation, now looking at me with something closer to genuine respect, I allowed myself, just for a moment, to hope that perhaps this particular story might end differently than so many of the ones that had come before it. Not with an empire destroyed, but with the beginning of something that might, eventually, be built instead. "Thank you, Marcus Cade," Vesa said quietly, turning back toward the viewport, watching the stars slowly steady as the ship resumed its course. "For showing me how wrong I was." "You're welcome," I said, and for the first time since my capture, I found myself looking forward to whatever came next, rather than simply enduring it. The ship continued onward through the quiet dark, carrying us both toward a future neither of us could fully predict, but one that felt, for the first time in a long while, like it might hold more than simply another battle to survive.